Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesdays. Today, we are diving into a topic that I have wanted to explore for a while now. Earlier this month, I came across a writer on Substack who posted something that really struck me. In his piece, he was using dehumanizing language, assigned female at birth. And so while his intention was probably to be inclusive, I found it to be exclusive and just downright misogynistic. I mean, it reminded me back in 2020 and 2021, I had a few people, friends of mine, reach out to me on Instagram pointing out that we as a culture had shifted from using the term women to AFAB, assigned female at birth. My gut reaction was intense. I was like, what the hell is going on here? It also reminds me of when I was living in Portland, Oregon. I was constantly stressed back then, seeking external validation, and I lacked the courage to speak up against gender ideology, and this was around 2013, 2015, and little did I know it was absolutely going to take over the entire world. So today, we're going to dive into the consequences of transgenderism and its impact on children. And here's the thing. I am no longer afraid of being canceled or ridiculed because honestly, I've already lost all my friends. And at this point, I have come to appreciate who I am, and standing for truth in today's world has never been more important. It is worth every consequence. So how did we get here? Let's dive into the origins of gender ideology. So in order to understand how we went from recognizing biological sex as reality to where we are now, which is debating whether we can even say the word woman in medical journals or in public, let's dive into how this whole mess got started. And it was by this psychologist named John Money in the 1950s. He was one of the first people to separate gender from sex, arguing that gender was a social construct, independent of biology. So let's expand more on what John Money did in his experiments, because that is crucial to expose the disturbing origins of gender ideology. So he was a psychologist, he was a sexologist, and that was instrumental in pushing this idea that gender ideology was entirely socially constructed, separate from biological sex. However, his most infamous experiment, the case of David Reimer, reveals the dark and unethical foundation of this belief system. David Reimer was born male alongside his identical twin brother, Brian. After a botched circumcision, Money convinced his parents to raise David as a girl, Brenda, after undergoing surgery and hormone treatments. Money believed that this would prove that gender identity was purely a matter of socialization. However, David never truly identified as a female. He struggled with severe psychological distress, and eventually he just rejected this imposed identity in his teenage years and transitioned back to male. His twin brother also suffered severe emotional distress, and both tragically died by suicide in their 30s, and this is a devastating consequence to Money's reckless experimentations. The nature versus nurture debate is at the heart of this issue. Money's work was attempting to prove that nurture, which is socialization and upbringing, could completely override biological sex. Yet, the failure of the Reimer case demonstrated the opposite. Biology plays an undeniable role in identity and development. And we saw here that attempting to force individuals into gender identities that contradict their biology often leads to severe psychological distress. While John Money championed the idea that gender was purely a social construct, his ideological opponent, Dr. Milton Diamond, spent decades proving otherwise. Diamond, who was a biologist and a sexologist, conducted extensive research showing that biological sex has an innate influence on identity. He exposed the flaws in Money's work, particularly the David Reimer case, and argued that forcing an identity contrary to one's biology leads to immense suffering. Diamond's work underscores the importance of acknowledging biological sex while still allowing for individual gender expression, which is a stance completely at odds with today's gender ideology, which seeks to erase biological realities altogether, which is where my beef comes in. Intersex conditions are often misused as a justification for erasing sex-based distinctions. And so while, yes, intersex individuals exist, They make up a small fraction of the population and do not negate the binary nature of human sexual reproduction. Most intersex conditions result in variations of male or female biology, not a third sex. So using intersex as a reason to eliminate sex-based language ultimately harms both intersex and non-intersex individuals by denying the reality of biological differences. So beyond the David Reimer case, Money's broader work was filled with moral controversies. His therapy sessions with young children were highly controversial and ethically disturbing by today's standards. He conducted what he called sexual rehearsal therapy, which involved encouraging children to engage in sexual activities with their parents or siblings as a form of treatment for various psychological issues. These sessions were intended to help children overcome sexual anxieties or developmental disorders, but they often crossed serious ethical boundaries and caused significant harm to the children involved, which were both the twins I mentioned earlier. And so the lack of informed consent, the inappropriate nature of these activities, and potential for long-term psychological damage has led to widespread criticism of Money's methods. But despite all this, Money's ideas have laid the foundation for modern gender ideology. His theories, though discredited by cases like David Reimer, were absorbed into academia and later expanded upon by activists. The result? A cultural shift where subjective identity is prioritized over biological reality, and dissent is often met with backlash. So I think understanding the origins of gender ideology is crucial because it reveals the shaky foundation upon which these ideas are built. Science, ethics, and real-world consequences all point to the same conclusion that biology matters, and attempts to erase it will come at significant human cost. So his theories were later expanded by Judith Butler in the 1990s, who pushed the idea that gender is performative and entirely detached from biology. This philosophy has now morphed into the idea that sex itself is a social construct. And this leads me into Monica Helms, who's the trans flag creator, which is a window into how gender ideology has evolved. And so Monica Helms, who was born Robert Hodge, designed the trans pride flag in 1999. And as we all know, this flag is baby blue and baby pink. So according to Guinevere Gluck, who wrote in Redux magazine, she shared that Dr. Sarah Good, the CEO of Stop SO, which is Specialist Treatment Organization for the Prevention of Sexual Offending, pedophiles who organize online have developed their own culture, language, and symbols. And one common symbol that is used in pedophile forums include the colors of baby pink, blue, and white. And in her lecture, and all this is linked in the show notes, Hidden Knowledge, What We Ought to Know About Pedophiles, she shows a slide of the image and says, the pink half represents girl lovers and the blue half represents boy lovers. The color code system appears to predate the initial design of the transgender flag and can be traced back to at least as early as 1997, according to online pro-pedo forums. Areas in Europe that advertise to child trafficking and pedophile sex tourists use this color code. Blue curtains mean the boy child prostitute, and pink curtains mean a girl. So, it is unclear whether Helms was aware of this correlation at the time, but when discussing the symbolism between the trans flag in an interview in 2017, Helms stated that the blue represents young boys and the pink represents young girls. Whatever the case may be, his personal history and writings reveal disturbing patterns that echo the unsettling dynamics of gender ideology that we've already seen in figures like Dr. John Money. Helms, who obviously identifies as a woman, has long been involved in controversial and fetish behaviors, even writing about forced feminization in his erotic short stories. So these writings include very disturbing themes such as sexualization of minors, notably in a short story where a man marries a young girl who ages slowly, reflecting a disturbing fantasy that came to him in a dream. In his memoir, More Than Just a Flag, Helms describes his bi-gender identity as an enlightened being that floats between multiple identities, switching from male to female, sometimes simultaneously or in an instant. He recalls times of experimentation, especially as an adult, where he would wear clothing that's inappropriate for his age and faced consequences for doing so at work. Adding another deeply unsettling layer to this conversation, Helms, who was 70 at the time in 2022, made headlines claiming to have changed his age to 25. And given the logic behind this, age shift sparked a very viral conversation, with some of the commenters then pointing out, okay, so that makes your partner, Darlington Wagner, would be now just 16 years old. So this raises questions. How fluid can identity get if we can extend it beyond gender into age? Slippery slope. So we have seen gender ideology increasingly becoming intertwined with political movements, the Democratic Party. So initially, intellectual discussions around gender began with French philosophers whose ideas about the body, power, and identity influenced later iterations of what we now have as gender theory. But those complex ideas and theories, they've been stripped of any nuance and rebranded into political dogma that now dominates much of the left-leaning discourse. So the Democratic Party, which once upon a time championed civil rights and social justice, now finds itself navigating a very fine line between advocating for freedom and accommodating forces that seek to change the very definition of identity itself. But I mean, at what cost? The more corporate interests and industries that gain traction in shaping these ideologies, the more that the left's original values of anti-corporate resistance has become a very distant memory. Which brings us to today's nightmare. So from fringe theory to political dogma, how the heck did gender ideology take over the Democratic Party? So how did academic theorizing become an institutionalized belief system within mainstream politics, particularly the DNC? I think that this transformation happened through several key developments. The first one is the rise of queer theory in academia. So universities became breeding grounds for gender ideology through the 1990s and the early 2000s. Gender studies departments were influenced by postmodernist philosophy, which says that there's no objective truth. And this framed gender as entirely fluid, rejecting biological sex distinctions. And so as students trained in these theories, they were graduating, took positions in media, education, and activism. They carried these ideas into broader society. And James Lindsay, in his podcast, The New Discourses, covers this topic far better and in far more depth than I ever could. Highly recommend it. Second, institutional capture and activism. So activist organizations like the Human Rights Campaign, HRC, and American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, were completely radicalized, and they began pushing gender ideology into corporate policies, legal frameworks, and public schools. Their influence, combined with rapid spread of social media, helped mainstream these concepts far beyond the academic world. And so Vivek Ramaswamy, and forgive me if I mispronounce his name, he was going to be a part of DOJ, but now is the senator for Ohio, I believe. He wrote a book, Woke Inc., and I highly recommend it because he talks about how this ideology has captured capitalism, and those on the left hate capitalism. And if they could see how connected all of this was to big pharma and profits and the destruction of humanity, I really don't think they would be behind it all. I just don't understand why they are, and I hope that I can get through to some people with this podcast. So legal and policy shifts. So under the Obama administration, gender ideology gained political traction, particularly through Title IX reinterpretation that mandated schools to accommodate self-declared gender identities. And this was further expanded under the Biden administration, with policies requiring federally funded institutions to adopt gender-affirming policies in sports, healthcare, and education. Let's talk about the hilarious double standards around the billionaires funding the LGBT movement, because we've all seen the left melting down right now over Trump and Elon and the influence of billionaires and the constitutional crisis, or whatever they're screaming now, except of course when billionaires are funding the agendas that they support, right? So an article linked in the podcast episode blog, First Things, calls out some of the big names behind the LGBT movement, and guess what? It shows this massive contradiction. So number 4, big tech and media reinforcement. So social media platforms, major news outlets, and entertainment industries began actively promoting gender ideology while censoring dissenting views. And this created a cultural environment where questioning gender ideology was framed as hateful or bigoted, further entrenching it within left-wing politics. And last one, the redefinition of civil rights. So transgender identity was increasingly framed as the next major civil rights frontier, equating sex-based protections with racial and disability rights. This shifted the Democratic Party's platform to fully embracing gender ideology, making skepticism or critique politically unacceptable within the mainstream liberal discourse. So although activists present the LGBT movement as a weak, powerless group suffering oppression and discrimination, in truth, it wields enormous power and influence and increasingly uses it to remake our schools, our laws, and society. The shift from women to AFAB, erasing women for ideology. So why has the term women, woman been replaced with AFAB, assigned female at birth, or chest feeding, or pregnant people? The justification is saying women is exclusionary to trans-identified females. But in reality, this whole concept is just deeply misogynistic. Jennifer Black, in her Dispatches from the 11th Hour essays, have done an incredible job exposing how gender ideology isn't some organic civil rights movement, but it's a well-funded social engineering project backed by billionaires and biotech companies. She points out that this linguistic shift isn't just about inclusion, it's about destabilizing categories of sex for the benefit of corporate and medical industries. When you erase the words women, woman, you erase our ability to advocate for our needs. You make it harder to talk about female-specific health issues, and you make it easier for policies to prioritize ideology over science. And this leads me to the next section. I want to talk about the medical and scientific consequences of erasing sex. So podcast listeners, in the blog, I have a photo that breaks down the barriers and the ideas proposed and how to increase participation of women in clinical trials. And so this isn't just an abstract cultural issue. It has real, dangerous consequences for medicine and science. Historically, women have been excluded from medical research. For decades, studies were conducted almost exclusively on male subjects, and these results were assumed to apply to women. I mean, the problem, women are not small men. We have different hormonal cycles, different metabolic rates, and different responses to medications. So here are just a few examples of how ignoring biological sex in medicine harms women. Number 1, heart disease. Women's symptoms are very different from men's, and because most research was done on men, women are more likely to be misdiagnosed. ACL injuries, like in your knee, women are at significantly higher risk due to differences in hip structure and ligament laxity, yet training protocols are still modeled on male athletes. And lastly, medication dosages. Women metabolize drugs differently, but dosages are often tested on male bodies, leading to overdoses or ineffective treatments for women. So just in 2016, the NIH finally mandated that women be included in medical research, which is a huge step forward. But now, under gender ideology, we're reversing that progress by saying we can't acknowledge sex at all. If we're replacing women's health with AFAB health, how do we effectively study and treat female-specific conditions like PCOS, endometriosis, and pregnancy-related complications? We don't, because that's the point. So the connection between transgenderism and transhumanism. So as the journalist Stella Morabito has written, transgenderism is a vehicle for state power and censorship. It is tyranny dressed up in the clothes of what has become the carcass of the progressive left, and it seeks absolute power and control over humanity and nature. And this is where things get dark. So Jennifer Black and other researchers have pointed out how gender ideology is just one arm of a larger movement, transhumanism, the belief that humanity should merge with technology, that our bodies are obsolete, and that we should ultimately move beyond biology altogether. I mean, think about what the transgender movement pushes. The idea that our bodies are wrong and need to be medically altered, a reliance on synthetic hormones for life, and the normalization of body modification to fit identity over reality. And now let's zoom out. Who benefits from this ideology? Pharmaceutical companies. Big pharma. That's right. The same billionaires pushing trans activism are also deeply invested in AI, biotech, and synthetic biology. Oligarchs on both the political right, like Peter Thiel, and the left, like Jeff Bezos, are investing in transhumanism and the gender industry. J.D. Vance is a part of this. He is the co-founder of Nara Capital, spelled Narya, and he's invested in Amplify Bio, which has announced a strategic partnership with RNAV8 to support rMNA therapeutic developers. Even Maha's hero, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., has invested in CRISPR technology. Financial disclosures released in January of 2025 revealed that he holds investments in CRISPR Therapeutics, which is a company specializing in gene editing technologies, as well as Dragonfly Therapeutics, which focuses on immunotherapies. So despite his history of expressing concerns about gene editing technologies, he did state that he will divest from these companies if confirmed, which he has been, as the Secretary of HHS. So, Mr. Secretary, we're keeping eyes on you. And of course, I haven't even mentioned Elon Musk with Neuralink and who knows what else that guy has planned. I'm a big fan of Doge and the exposure of the corruption, yet I definitely keep a skeptical eye on him as well, because I think the goal when it comes to transhumanism, it's not to let people live as their authentic selves. I think the goal is to dissolve sex-based reality entirely, making people dependent on medical interventions for life. And this isn't liberation. I think it's medical enslavement. Brave New World Revisited, the synthetic creation of culture. So earlier this year, I read Huxley's Brave New World, and it didn't read as fiction. It actually read as if he had a crystal ball looking into the future. Because in his dystopia, human reproduction was industrialized, the family unit was obsolete, and people were engineered for compliance under the guise of progress. Sound familiar? The push for synthetic reproduction, the erasure of sex-based identity, and the growing narrative that biology itself is a problem all mirror Huxley's warning. An author I've mentioned many times in today's episode, Jennifer Bilek, she exposes in her essays, Dispatches from the 11th Hour, how transhumanism is the end game. The same corporate interests that are promoting gender ideology are also pioneering artificial wombs, genetically modified embryos, and bioengineered organ harvesting. This is a world where human beings are no longer conceived but manufactured, where the natural biological family has been replaced by state-sanctioned lab-grown life. Huxley warned us about a future where people would love their servitude, where the loss of freedom was framed as liberation, and the future that's unfolding right now. And so the question that I want to propose to all of us, are we resisting dehumanization, or are we simply embracing it under a new name? And this goes for IVF as well. That is a rabbit hole that I have not unpacked, but I want to push back on IVF and surrogacy. Sorry, not sorry, ladies. So in summary, how do we fight back against the erasure of women? What should we do? What can we do? I think we, number one, refuse to comply with the ideological language. Women are women, not AFABs. The end. Point blank. Period. Number two, call out the erasure of sex in medicine and in policy. We must advocate for sex-based language in healthcare. Do not let them say chest feeding, pregnant people. No. Number three, expose the billionaires who are funding this movement. This is not grassroots activism. It is top-down social engineering. And please check the links I have in the show notes, because there's plenty of research if you want to go down this rabbit hole, and I suggest you do. So the fight to protect reality isn't just about ideology. This is about protecting women. It's about protecting children. It's about safeguarding science, and it's about ensuring future generations don't grow up in a world where female is a forbidden word. So if you enjoyed this conversation, you're not going to want to miss an upcoming interview I have with one of the co-founders from Transition Justice, which is a nonprofit organization that connects individuals who have been negatively affected by gender medicine, including detransitioners, with legal assistance. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and just so you know, this organization, Transition Justice, operates under the umbrella of Partners for Ethical Care, PEC. And that group raises awareness and supports efforts to stop what they consider as unethical treatment of children by institutions who promote gender identity affirmation. So PEC's mission emphasizes the belief that no child is born in the wrong body. So be sure you're subscribed so you won't miss that upcoming conversation. And if you've yet to leave me a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify, that would be greatly appreciated. Or find me on Substack. I'd love to hear your thoughts, in particular about complex and controversial subjects like this one. So until then, maintain your curiosity, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in. Have a great week.